On the 8th of May 2008, 18-year-old Joshua Maddux left his family house after telling his sister that he's going for a walk, which wasn't unusual for him, especially that he liked hiking alone. However, he didn't return from it, leading to a search for him that lasted for 7 unfortunate years, until the shocking discovery of his naked body, stuffed in an old cabin's chimney that was only 1 mile away from his family house all alone. In 2015, less than a mile away, a local builder by the name of Chuck Murphy was demolishing his old log cabin to make way for property development. The cabin hadn't been used in years, with the insides of it smelling like rot that he thought was dead animals. But as they tore down the chimney, they made a grim discovery. Stuffed inside the chimney was the mummified body of Joshua Maddux, who lived in Woodland Park in Teller County, Colorado. Josh was 6 feet tall, 150 pounds. He was considered a free spirit, well liked and well known. His mother and father were divorced, and Josh lived with his father Mike and 2 sisters. As the days passed and Josh had still not returned, his father took the sudden disappearance more seriously, and on the 13th of May he called the police to report Josh missing. The search was spread far and wide, scouring the neighborhood and wider parkland area. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned to months, yet still, no clue to his disappearance had been uncovered. Says his father, "I got up one morning and Josh was there. Then he just never came home. The next day he still didn't come home. I called his friends, nobody had seen him, nobody knows where he is." The hope of finding Josh began to fade, and his sister Kate spoke of how she had always hoped that he had simply skipped town to go play music or start a different life, and held on to the hope of such an eventuality. His family had no reason to believe that Josh had gotten into any trouble, although they were concerned about his mental health, because 2 years prior to his disappearance, on June 1st, 2006, a week before his high school graduation, Josh's old brother Zachary had committed suicide, with the father saying that it was especially heavy on Josh because of their good relationship, that it almost pushed him over the edge. But Josh's family noted that Josh had been doing well and was happy around the time he disappeared, with the police also having no reason to suspect any criminal activity, with his case file remaining open, until the discovery of his body in a cabin that sat on a large patch of land surrounded by tall pine trees. The cabin hadn't been used for over 10 years and had fallen into a state of disrepair, until Chuck had made the decision to tear it down. And as they dismantled the chimney and reached the interior, Chuck made the horrifying discovery of the body of a young man crammed into a fetal position with his legs above his head. He called the police, who arrived and positively identified the corpse to be that of missing Joshua Maddux. With the Maddux family being horrified and shocked by this news, and his sister thinking that he was checking out the cabins and possibly a horrible accident had happened, the Teller County coroner undertook an autopsy and found no evidence of any drug in Josh's system. Speaking to the press, he stated, "The heart tissue showed no sign of trauma. There were no broken bones, no knife marks, there were no bullet holes," which didn't provide a lot of answers to how something like this came to happen. And with the cabin being only 2 blocks away from the Maddux family home, yet the searchers had overlooked the building because it has no sign of life inside the old structure. And the police suggested if Josh had cried for help, no one would have been able to hear him regardless, because of how secluded the cabin was. With the county coroner confirming that it was not an instant death, and how he died is only a matter of speculation. But we know that he didn't starve to death, because that takes many weeks. But then there's dehydration, which can take just a few days, and the other thing would be hypothermia, which could take a day or 2. We have no evidence to say which one came first. And eventually, on the 28th of September 2015, after failing to find any rational cause, a ruling of accidental death was made, suggesting that Josh had climbed down the chimney and got stuck in the brickwork, and that the most likely cause of death was hypothermia, as the temperature around the time of his disappearance had dropped to -6°C at its coldest, also stating that Josh's position in the chimney appeared to have been a voluntary act in order to gain access. All of this with Chuck questioning the coroner's conclusion of accidental death, stating that this would in fact have been impossible because the chimney had been built 20 years prior, and during its construction it had been fitted with a steel rebar, a large thick wire mesh hung from the steel hooks used to keep animals and debris from becoming stuck inside the chimney or from entering the cabin itself. This led to a subtle and public back and forth between the builder and the coroner, replying that the grate could have been rusted or corroded. especially that nobody saw the metal mesh, possibly because of the demolition. All the metal work had been collected and stashed into the back of a truck to be taken for scrap, which would explain why the mesh was not clearly identified by the coroner, as it wasn't anywhere near the chimney, even if it was on the site at all at the time of the visit by the coroner and the police, which led to the coroner to reopen the case 3 days after his initial conclusion, because there were several other pieces of information which failed to make any sense, aside from the chimney rebar. To put it simply, the dots just weren't connecting. While on the other hand, there was for one thing the mysterious shifting of a large wooden breakfast bar that had been torn from a wall in the kitchen and dragged over to block the chimney from the inside of the cabin, which probably was the very reason that Chuck himself had not noticed anything unusual about the chimney in the first place, until it was demolished. However, the question remained that if the breakfast bar had been torn from the wall, then who had done it, and when, and most importantly, why? Especially with Josh's body being found with his legs above his head and disjointed from his torso, which to get into such a position, he would have had to have entered the chimney head first, which was a fairly unusual position, with the coroner stating earlier that he thought it would have taken 2 people to position Josh in such a way. And to add to that confusion, when Josh's body was found, he was naked from the waist down, only wearing a thin thermal t-shirt, with the rest of his clothes folded and put in front of the chimney, inside the cabin, with Chuck stating, "This one really taxed our brains. We found his clothes just outside the firebox. He only had a thermal t-shirt on. We don't know why he took his clothes off, took his shoes and socks off, and why he went inside, climbed on the roof and went down the chimney. It just wasn't linear thinking." But nonetheless, the coroner concluded that given his options, that a cause of death being accidental death, murder or undetermined causes, he finally concluded that the most plausible explanation is that it's an accident, and he did come down the chimney, and that's our conclusion. But with the public and Maddux family not being convinced, the country coroner mentioned that several calls had been made to both the police and coroner's office, suggesting lead and naming suspects that had bragged of killing Josh. One suspect in particular, which was spending time in a Texas jail and had previous time in a Seattle and Portland prisons, was a long list of violent criminal behavior. The tips had told the coroner of how he was. Apparently, the last man to have been seen was Josh, but the police and coroner could not place him at the crime scene, stating, "They can't give me times and specifics, and we can't generate stuff that goes back 7 years. He also doubted that the man would have been able to have positioned Josh in the chimney in such a position alone. But as a turn in events, an online post on Reddit in 2015, which reads as if it was made most likely from one of the very people who had called into the coroner, suspecting the previously spoken of man. The post gave a name to the suspect, which leads to many new facts, stating, "I went to high school with this skinny dorky hippie named Andy, who played guitar in a band. I was never good friends with him or anything, but a year or so after I graduated, one of my good friends, Josh, started hanging out with him and then went missing. Turns out that in addition to becoming a lot scarier looking, Andy had indeed headed down to New Mexico, getting involved with the caretaker of a disabled guy, and got invited over to their apartment. Caretaker gets in the shower, and when he comes back out, the disabled guy is stabbed to death and Andy's gone. And when Andy got arrested, he also claimed to have killed the woman in towels and stuffed her body in a barrel. And indeed, the cops had found the woman stuffed in a barrel in towels, but already had somebody in custody for it and decided to stick with that guy instead. Years later, I found out that the caretaker had died in a bar fight, and without him, the cops didn't have much in the way of evidence somehow. So that case against Andy was dropped too." The Reddit post author also stated, "Several of us went to the cops saying, 'Hey, Josh who went missing was last seen with Andy who's a murderer. Maybe you should check that out.' Despite a fair amount of pushing, nothing ever really came of it. And by nothing I mean that the police mostly didn't even return our calls, and once accidentally cancelled the bulletin on Josh, because he's alive and well and living in the next town over, which he definitely wasn't. And in addition to Josh having last been seen with Andy, immediately before his stabbing spree, people called in to report having heard rumors that Andy was bragging about having put Josh in a hole. Also stating in the post, as far as I can tell, nobody even bothered to call Andy to ask if he knew anything. And by the way, from what I hear, Andy is still out and about, doing his thing when he's not in the mental hospital. And as it happens, Andy, or Andrew Richard Newman, does in fact exist with records of the stated crimes, and apparently lived quite a free lifestyle, so it is not unthinkable, and one might suggest that Andy and Josh may very well have known of each other, confirming the rumors. In conclusion, the case of Joshua Maddux is quite complex for several reasons, from Chuck Murphy's concerns about the rebar in the chimney and also considering the other factors, like the clothes by the fireplace, the breakfast bar track to cover the fireplace, and the numerous tip-offs concerning Andy. The biggest mystery is why this Andy wasn't at least questioned about it by the police. Whether or not the case will ever be reopened or further investigated, it remains in a grey area, with all the interlinked evidence and mystery surrounding how and why it happened. It still remains dark and mysterious, with the official conclusion of the county coroner standing to this day as an accidental death. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you didn't, or you have an opinion or a video topic suggestion, tell me in the comments. See you in the next video.